Kia ora koutou katoa. Hi, everybody. Good morning. It's great to be here. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm going to start today by telling you guys about the time I got fired when I was 16 years old. It's a pretty funny story. So, I'm American. I grew up as a military brat. So for those of you who don't know, I had a family who was in the military, and you move around quite a bit. And so I kind of grew up on and off military bases around the world. When I was a teenager, we lived in Germany, and I was going to school in Ramstein Air Force Base. So a base is kind of an interesting place. So the inside is totally American. There's airplanes that take off and land, and there's these military police outside who are sentries and look at your ID when you come in, and everybody's in uniform. There are men carrying guns and women. And so it's a really interesting experience. So when I was 16, I got a job at a music store, and it was the 90s, so we sold CDs. And one of the things that I really enjoyed, the experience about working at this store, was we got to play whatever music we wanted when it was our shift. So in the 90s, Baz Luhrmann released Romeo and Juliet, which I'm sure many of you remember this film. And so every time I worked, I would just blast the soundtrack, you know, because amazing. It was like rock up in my parents' station wagon, blast the soundtrack. It was awesome. Except, apparently, some of the songs had explicit lyrics that I wasn't really paying attention to. So I got called into the manager's office one day, and they said, you know, you're not really modeling the proper values for the Air Force Base, and you know, we're going to need you to admit that you broke the rules. And you know, I kind of said, oh, I didn't know. And anyway, subsequently got fired. So anyway, it kind of got me thinking later on in life about, you know, what does it mean? So I was sort of living this life, going to school and working on a military base, but I was also living in the middle of Germany, in a country in Europe. So it's kind of going on and off this periphery and kind of shifting identities, I guess. And as a military brat my whole life, and I'm sure other military brats agree, people will ask you, hey, so where are you from? And you kind of go, well, I'm from, you know, and it's the struggle of being from everywhere but being from nowhere. So that got me thinking about this word periphery. And actually, what makes the inside of the periphery so exclusive? What is it that makes it so special? What is it that we're paying so much attention to in the middle? And because I'm a word nerd and a logophile, I started digging into the etymology of the word periphery. And when you start to break the word down into the Greek, peripheria, the first breakdown, is the geometric definition. So that means the line around the circle. And that just kind of started to get into my thoughts and brought me to inclusive design. So again, that juxtaposition of inside and outside, inclusive and exclusive. And what does that all mean? And so this term, we hear it a lot. It's thrown around a lot. Strategists, researchers, designers, everybody's, I think even more in 2020, we're hearing this term inclusive. So I was kind of digging into the history of inclusive design a little bit, right? And so we really owe a lot to disability activists. So just to kind of do a little brief history, so after the Great Wars, so World War I and World War II is when people around the world started seeing men coming home from those wars with actual physical disabilities. So they started to see people in wheelchairs, people with limps, people with all sorts of disabilities that previously had been unseen. And so particularly in Japan, Germany, and the United States, this was quite prevalent. And at the time, disability activists were really advocating for barrier-free access to physical space at the time. So when people were in wheelchairs, the ability to just enter and exit a building was a problem. And so this term sort of universal design was born kind of then. And disability activists in the United States actually modeled some of their work after what civil rights and Black Americans were doing at the time, who were also advocating for their right to space. And so it became this powerful movement, and people started throwing that word universal design, everyone should have access, In the UK, they actually came up with the word inclusive design, and there were different iterations around this throughout the world. I don't think any one country or any one person owns sort of that. Is it universal? Is it inclusive? Today, you hear design for all, design for good, ethical design, accessibility. So these are all variations on the theme of the right to access space. And so the big takeaway that disability activists have achieved, and in 2020, I think we're still kind of learning this, but it started that disability was a fixed state. So they thought of it as a person has some kind of disability or some kind of illness or something that limits them, and that is forever, and that's the way it is, and that's this person, and we have other types of people over here. And what's happened is that we've realized that episodic disability will affect us all. So you might have a twisted ankle, maybe you're walking with children, maybe you're walking with an elderly parent, maybe you're having a particularly emotional day, maybe there's a pandemic. So a lot of things affect our ability to access space. And so people started to become aware of, oh hey, we don't need to just build for this little group of people over here. They started to think differently about what they were building and what they were designing. And so what came out of that was what I'm calling is unintentional gains, or improved outcomes for all. So they started designing solutions that were applicable to mass market, not just to people in wheelchairs or people living with different disabilities. So one thing I'll talk about is, I'm sure you can see this triangle here, is the ramp. It's not really much to say about ramps. I know it's also a vegetable, but I started looking at the history of ramps. It's actually quite interesting. So it's one of the first things that disability activists achieved. And again, just to help people get in and out of buildings, help people in wheelchairs get in and out of buildings. They started advocating for these ramps to be built. But why is that important? Well, hospitals started using ramps after that. Why? Because they have patients on beds with wheels. And then places where our elderly ancestors and whānau lived, they started putting ramps there because they were like, oh, people are older, we need to help them get into the building. And then industries where people were using heavy equipment and putting things on wheels and pushing them in. So it started growing and growing and growing, and people started realizing, oh, hey, ramps are actually, everybody can use ramps. I mean, there's just so many use cases for this. Same thing for automatic doors. Automatic doors were designed and then had all kinds of use cases. I mean, imagine today in COVID. We definitely don't want to touch doorknobs. Same thing for typewriters. Typewriters were designed for people who needed to type out their messages and couldn't necessarily speak them. SMS texting, same thing, was designed for people who couldn't speak on the telephone. Closed captioning. So closed captioning was designed so that people who are hard of hearing could read the words on the screen, but it turns out they've done a whole boatload of research into closed captioning, and it actually helps children learn faster and more efficiently than a lot of other things they were trying. And it also had reverberations into translating, movies and television for various multilingual audiences. So all these things that were originally a niche design for people, quote unquote, living with a disability actually improved life for everybody. Chemotherapy pumps, same thing. So designed for people to be able to do chemotherapy at home by having a wearable device, and then actually morphed into insulin pumps. So I'm a type 1 diabetic. I wore an insulin pump for 20 years. So a vast difference, right? So we build something for one group of people, and then it ends up being useful for everyone. So to transition, so Te Ao Māori. So why am I talking about that? Well, I'm learning about Te Ao Māori, the Māori worldview, and since I immigrated to Aotearoa, I've started to learn more. And the Māori worldview is that the tangata, or the people, are deeply, deeply connected to the whenua, or the land. And this is the central learning of the Māori worldview. And so as I was sort of reflecting back on all of this research on people living with disabilities and disability advocates, I started to think about how today I've noticed that a lot of our organizations are kind of doing this act of trying to be more inclusive and trying to learn more about Te Ao Māori. And we're trying to bring that into our design teams, and we're trying to bring that into our thought processes. But what I want to say is this: let's not have it be a box-checking exercise. Let's not just do Te Ao Māori and be inclusive because we want to reach that hand outside the circle. In the same way in the beginning with disability advocates, it was let's build a small thing here that'll just apply to this group of people. And I think that's something that we need to consider. Again, the central theme of inclusive design is access. So giving people access to that space. giving people access to that exclusive part. So I'm gonna lead into 3 important things that I think make the center of the circle very exclusive, and 3 things that I think we should talk about. Because we're often over-focused on checking the box to reach the hand outside the circle to make sure we get I need this user group, and I need this user group, and we always need to look outside, because we're in the middle, and we're the designers, and we know it all. We need to wait a minute. Let's stop and shine a spotlight on the center. So the first thing I want to talk about is inherited hierarchies, power structures. So when we go into a team or an organization, a lot of times we're walking into something that's been there for a long time. So people have been there for a number of years. We look up to folks who have the most expertise, and that's kind of how our society works, and it's kind of how organizations work. You go in and the power structure is already there. You already know who's at the top, and we report to each other, and that's where the respect is. And so it got me thinking about how that can kind of influence the center of the circle. I read this book by Scott Sonnenschein, and he basically, so this book stretches basically about how you can do more with less. And he talks a lot about how we use our resources, by human resources, all the different types of resources that we have. And one thing that he talks about in this book that really affected me was he talked about the difference between expertise and innovation. So expertise, you might do something thousands of times and get really good at it. Like a neurosurgeon, they've got a lot of expertise. Innovation is what we're harvesting when we're trying to solve a problem, right? And so he made the point, and he's a behavioral scientist, and he looked at a lot of different studies that said, in order for you to be the most innovative, you really need to have different types of people solving problems in which they're not an expert. So he looked at studies from around the world and found that astrophysicists were actually better at solving the chemistry problems than the chemists, and biologists were better at solving environmental science problems than the scientists who spent all their time on the environment. And he kept finding this over and over and over again. And so he made the point that, in order for us to be innovative, we kind of need to go against the things that we normally do. So we normally look to the people that have the most experience, who have been there the longest. And sometimes we need to look at people that we never gave a chance to in order to solve that problem. The second thing I'll talk about is cultural currency. And as a person who immigrated to Aotearoa, and I'll speak for all immigrants, this is something that we really have to face. And so the word currency kind of evokes this notion of exchange. So when you go into another culture, and this could be an organizational culture as well, it could be a team culture, you're exchanging something with everybody. And in order to exchange with everyone, you need to be able to know what the value system is. You need to be able to know what it is that people value. So when I immigrated here, I realized that I needed to start learning about rugby. Okay? I needed to know about the All Blacks because I didn't know anything, and I was like, I need to be able to have certain conversations with certain people, and I need to learn a few things. And so you kind of put yourself in this learning mind. And for anyone joining a new space, you're in the learning mind because you're not in the center of the circle. You're not on the inside of the periphery. And so you kind of have to put yourself in a space to learn what those exchanges are. Pierre Bourdieu. So this man is brilliant. I highly recommend reading him. It's definitely a high dose of academia, so sit down with a long black or something before you do it. But he's got this book, Forms of Capital. And he talks about all of the different forms of capital in society that actually influence how humans interact. So social capital, cultural capital, economic capital, and these all influence the way that teams interact, and they influence the way that organizations interact. And what Bourdieu was about was revealing the hidden value system in society that shapes the way that we actually think about our fellow human beings and the way that we interact with them. And so highly recommend reading him. And he talked a lot about cultural capital, which is related to the idea that I was talking about, cultural currency. The third thing I think we should consider that makes the inside of that circle so exclusive, it's just baseline psychology. So anyone here who's studied psychology is not going to be surprised by what I'm about to say. It's not new. So everything that we're doing and thinking and feeling and seeing a lot of times is based on the neurochemistry, neurobiology that we already possess. It's not necessarily something that we're doing of our own free will in the moment. So there's this theory, passive frame theory, scientist is called Ezekiel Mosella. And what he said was that actually 90% of your brain is operating unconsciously in the background. So most of what you think you're making a decision on that you call free will, your brain already decided what it is. So if you apply that to the dynamics on a team or in an organization, we're just operating off of our program running in the background, the brain chemistry. And what does that have to do with design and people who we listen to and people whose ideas we choose to explore? And what does that mean when we encounter someone who has an idea very different than one that we have? Or perhaps a different value system that they subscribe to, or maybe a different power structure? What does that mean? Well, as human beings, it would be very human for us to operate out of our fear mindset. And so most of us are, a lot of times when we don't check ourselves, operating out of a fear-based mindset. Because we want to be in the middle and we want everyone to have the same currency, and let's all worship the same power structure. And if things go off of that, it's different for us. It's a bit scary. It's scary to do that, right? And so I think the first thing is to put a light on that and say, we're all human beings. We all evolved from Australopithecus and all of these different wonderful creatures. And at the end of the day, we're all at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're looking for food. We're looking for safety. We're looking for a sense of security. And different ideas, so innovation, is going to threaten that sense of security. And I think we have to be bold enough to recognize that that's okay, because we're designers, strategists, and researchers, and we embrace that. One of my favorite authors, Haruki Murakami, is a noted Japanese novelist. I actually only read this book this year, Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. It's such a fantastic story. It's sort of that sci-fi, like psychological thriller. It's basically the story of a man who gets separated from his shadow. And the man is living in this sort of made-up world where there's no good and there's no bad, and it's just everything is calm, and it's just sort of the Zen world where everyone has lost their mind, but it's perfect and it's forever, it's eternal. And the shadow is living in the human world. And so there's a back and forth with the two of them about which world is better, and should the man stay in the made-up world or should he go back to the human world? And then there's this quote that I found that illustrates what I'm talking about beautifully. Or the shadow says to him, "The town is sealed like this. That's why the longer you stay in here, the more you get to thinking that things are normal." And that's exactly what I'm talking about when we're on our teams and we're not considering our exclusivity. When we're in organizations and we don't put the spotlight on ourselves and we're too busy, I need this user, I need a user like this, I need to reach a hand outside the circle. We start to think things on the inside are normal. So the three things I just mentioned, inherited hierarchies, which is that power structure we talked about, cultural currency, what we're exchanging, and baseline psychology, that, hey, we're just operating off of our neurochemistry. So what does all that mean? And I really thought long about this. What does that mean? There's kind of an assumptive goodness at the middle of the circle, isn't there? When we do inclusive design and we're trying to be inclusive and we bring people in because it's good in there, I don't think we intentionally walk around and say it's better in here than it is out there, but I just think it's part of our psychology. It's part of the value system. We just assume it's better in there. We want to reach that hand out because we want to include people in our idea, because we don't want things to be too different. So all those things come together, and it's the story that we're telling at the middle of the circle. And it's not just the story about the organization, it's not just the story about the design team, it's the story about ourselves. And so all those things come together and influence how we see ourselves, how we experience ourselves, how we interact with others. And that's very powerful. So what about the outside of the circle? So what about outsiders? I won't go into all of the research, but there's tons of it all over the webs, the interwebs, that outsiders always outperform insiders. Whenever there's some kind of crazy problem-solving challenge, outsiders always solve it. Why is that? Design thinking 101, you guys know this, because outsiders are super far removed from the problem and they have a view that no one else has. They're not using the same cultural currency, they're not subscribing to that power structure, they don't have as much fear because they don't believe in all those things. So outsiders are out there, and maybe they want to stay out there. Why do they have to always come in the circle? Maybe that's where they want to be. Second group I want to talk about are underdogs. I love underdogs. Underdogs are awesome. You know, it's like that sports team that never wins, but you're like, still rooting for them. Underdogs. So underdogs are fascinating because they actually have spent more time than anyone else studying those three things I talked about: the inherited hierarchy, the currency, the psychology. They have literally studied it, and they are checking the boxes, and they're studying it harder than everyone else. So Harvard Business Review did a study and said underdogs will beat the competition in teams every time because they'll work, 3 times as hard. And what I think is fascinating about that is that the studying that underdogs are doing. So a lot of times I think in organizations, underdogs kind of get a raw deal because they're like, oh, well, they're new, they just joined. Like, oh, let's put them on the small project because they just got here. Oh, he just graduated from uni, so, or they are just, they've not been doing it this long, so let's leave them over here. But underdogs have, they work really hard, they try really hard, they've really studied it. And so I think we've got to consider these two on the outside of the periphery. Ooh. So back to periphery, the word, digging back into the etymology. So as I started to cut the word up more when you really study it, the next, when you break it down, it breaks down into peripheris, which means I move around the circle. So we're going from that line to moving, and I thought that's interesting. Now we're moving around the circle in the definition of the word. And when you get to the final root of the word, it's actually férω, so P-H-E-R-O, pronounced férω. And that word is actually interesting because it's actually littered throughout the Bible. It's littered throughout a lot of ancient medical texts. And I thought, why is that? And so it translates to I bear. So it goes from a line to carrying something or moving around to bearing something to carrying something. And when you look at the biblical translations of what the word means, it actually means burden. And I thought, oh, so the periphery is the burden, the people outside are the burden. But I want to shift that for you guys and say, actually, we're the burden on the inside. All of those things I just talked about are our burden to carry, and we need to examine that. That's our burden to carry. What are we missing out on by carrying all that stuff around? It's our collective baggage, shall we say. So let's stop looking for people to include. Let's stop reaching that hand outside the circle, and let's start asking what practices and mindsets are exclusionary. Okay, and it's more than, and I'll just say I'm an American. Diversity and inclusion, and you know what? Black Lives Matter, they do. But let's stop this performative aspect. Oh, let's reach a hand out. And the same goes for Te Ao Māori. If we're gonna learn about Te Ao Māori, let's really learn it, and let's, while we're learning it, learn about ourselves. Because it's gonna be impossible to truly understand it and apply it to design and learn what the great Māori worldview has to offer us if we haven't examined our own and how we're gonna interplay with it. So 3 questions I'll leave you with. I don't like to do conclusions. I'm not going to tell you guys what to think or do, because you're going to have to find that out on your team and on your organization. But 3 questions I want to leave you with are, the first one is, do you want expertise when you're on a design team, or do you want innovation? Because it's not good, bad. Sometimes you need expertise. You need that designer who can come in and hammer it out. Or are you trying to solve a problem? And if so, get really creative about what type of innovation you need and who that person should be. The second one, what does the periphery exclude us from? So I think I've said this a couple of times now, but really think about what you might be missing out on by consistently subscribing to what's in the middle. And finally, what story are you telling? And I think this is the most important one. So how can we help our clients tell their story through design if we don't even know what story we're telling? How can we really help them? And I think that's the most important thing. So thank you so much. Please consider the periphery. It's been such a pleasure here. Thank you to UX New Zealand and Digital Arts Network, my team in Auckland. Thank you so much for supporting me, and everyone here. Such a pleasure speaking to you guys. Thank you.